Lynn, thank you very much for being out here and doing the invocation. What did everyone say? The foundation is really quite proud in hosting these Admiral Nimitz Dinners, where we get to recognize individuals who have really done significant service at the national and international level to our great nation. But I can tell you, it would not be possible without your all support. And I want to thank every single one of you who is here tonight and for purchasing a ticket. I also want to thank those of you who were generous enough to purchase a table. Without your help, it could not have been possible. We live in a great community here in Fredericksburg. For those of you who are from Fredericksburg, you know that. And this museum would not be possible without your great support. There are also some sponsors, very important sponsors mentioned in your program, and we could not do it once again without them. And, of course, there are a couple single individuals I'd like to recognize. We have a very small staff at the foundation, and they do really great work. I was able to convince one individual to be the chairman of this particular dinner committee, and Silka was the chairman of my wife was the chairman of the dinner committee. And Jasper Eisenberg, Jasper, where are you? She was the main staff lady. And we have 3 individual sponsors who were generous enough to purchase a table to where we could bring in the younger generation. And I really think it's quite important that these young guys and gals get to come in here, talk a little bit, and then most importantly, hear some of the individuals that we're able to bring in. And I'd like to recognize those 3 tables. First off, we have a table of high school students here, both from Fredericksburg and Kerrville, which is really quite important and appropriate since Admiral Nimitz was born here and moved to Kerrville when he was 5 years old. So please stand up and be recognized. Thank you. And we have students from University of Texas and the colleges in Kerrville. Thank you all very much for coming. Please stand up and be recognized. And those of you who have heard me talk know I talk about a continuum of service that we have in this country. And that continues, and we have a table here, both wounded warriors and active duty Marines and soldiers. Would you all please stand up and do that? We are a World War II museum. We have 4 World War II veterans here tonight. I'm going to talk about the 4th one in just a minute, but I'd like to recognize the other 3 World War II individuals that we have here tonight. First off, a Marine on the 3rd wave at Iwo Jima, which, as those of you know, just started a couple of weeks ago in February, 70 years ago. Sir, please stand up and be recognized. He just gave me his book. It's called Hell, I Do It All Over Again. And then, of course, no stranger to the museum here, 2 other individuals, Carl Duncan, United States Navy, and David Strauss, United States Marine Corps. Please stand up. the 24th of February, actually 130 years ago, Admiral Nimitz was born here in Fredericksburg. Most of you know that his father died before he was born, and his grandfather was his father figure. And his grandfather had been in the German merchant marine, and he used to tell young Chester Nimitz, the sea is like life. It's really quite tough. So what you have to do is study hard, work hard, and don't worry about the stuff that you cannot change. And I think Admiral Nimitz took that to heart, and his full life was absolutely dedicated to the service of this country. We have another individual like that, in my opinion, here with us tonight, our guest speaker. If anyone epitomizes the greatest generation, he does. He graduated, you can read his bio, I'm not going to read that. He graduated from Princeton with honors. He went into the Marine Corps as an artillery officer. I took the secretary through the museum today, and he was telling me a story about his landing on Peleliu, doing the second wave in Peleliu. First wave, they got bogged down the beach because the Japanese were on both sides and they were shooting down on them. He arrived in the second wave, and you know what's behind him, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and they're on a time schedule, they're coming. He didn't see anyone in charge there, so he started grabbing individuals and say, okay, you shoot that guy, you shoot that guy, you shoot that guy, you shoot that guy. And pretty soon, he cleared a path, and the rest of the landing came forward. Left the Marine Corps in 1945, got his doctorate from MIT, and has continued to serve this nation, both in education and in government. You've read some of what he did in the bio that we have, and in industry. But as the secretary was telling me the story about his landing on Peleliu, I remembered seeing him at a Senate Armed Services here a couple of weeks ago. He was there with Henry Kissinger and Madeleine Albright, and they were in front of Chairman McCain, and demonstrators came into the Senate hearing. And they stood behind Dr. Kissinger, and they were calling him war criminal, and they had handcuffs, and they were shouting, and they were screaming. Everyone in the audience was sort of sitting there, and as I watched this on television, there's only one guy who stood up. Secretary stood up, turned around, and sir, I think you had a flashback to Peleliu, because he was pointing at the guys there who were demonstrators. And if he had Marines behind him, they'd probably be taking them out. This is an individual who has given service to this country, both in war and peace. And we are privileged to have him here tonight. Will you please join me in welcoming former Secretary of State,
I got here this afternoon, my wife and I had a beeline with Mike to the museum. It just blew us away. It's about as interesting, it's educational, it's inspiring. There's all these interactive things that you can learn from it. And of course, having fought in the Pacific in World War II, sort of was, there I am in the Pacific. So it's a wonderful museum. You people are justified in being proud of it. So thank you for showing me that. I've learned a lot. Of course, it was a pleasure to see my minister, Kitty Lehman, here, but it brought back memories. She was my minister at St. Bede's Church in Palo Alto, and we thought she had a pretty good life. It was a pretty nice place. And then she left us. She said, I got to go back to Texas. Anyway, got to see her again. But we have a little connection with Admiral Nimitz. My wife's late husband's brother was his chief of staff when he was admiral in the Pacific. And then he came to San Francisco, and he was quite a figure in San Francisco. He started the first Navy ROTC at UC Berkeley. Lived on Green Island. There's a place there called Nimitz House. And so we feel that Admiral Nimitz, I know you claim him here, but he came a little bit. So I thought about what I might say here, and I thought I would do two things. One, reflect a little bit on Admiral Nimitz's life and what he did, and try to identify a few of the things that characterized him. Then I'll talk a little bit about some of the main issues facing our country today, and see if we wouldn't benefit by using some of Admiral Nimitz's ideas. So first of all, I have to say, he was a smart guy. He graduated 7th in his class from the Naval Academy. But he also was a fighter, and he could come back. Can you imagine, as an ensign, he ran a ship aground and got court-martialed, and he could come back and become an admiral? Boy, you gotta be a fighter to do that. That's terrific. So he was a fighter, and he fought to win. Then he was an innovator. He took submarines from gasoline to diesel to nuclear. He also, I think, was the first guy to do a at-sea refueling. So he was willing to think outside the box and work outside the box and do things a little differently. And all of these attributes are really important, I think, as we look and see what's going on right now and what can we do about it. So let me first lay in the background of what happened in the post-World War II period, and then where we are today and what we should be doing about it. At the end of the Second World War, some gifted people, mostly in the U.S., people named names like Atchison and Marshall and others, looked back, and what did they see? They saw two world wars. They saw the first one was settled in rather vindictive terms that outlead the second. They saw that 61 million people were killed in the Second World War, not uninjured, despite that. They saw the Holocaust. They saw the Great Depression and the currency manipulation and protectionism that aggravated it. And they said to themselves, what a crummy world. And we are part of it, whether we like it or not. So they set out to create something better. And just as they got going, along comes the Cold War. So ideas emerge. The idea of containment, NATO, the Bretton Woods system, the Marshall Plan, various ideas, and then all through the post-World War II. And instead of vindictive with Germany and Japan, we said to them, look, be open societies with a decent economy and join the world. And they did. So instead of a vindictive peace, We had an inclusive peace, and it worked. And I think it's fair to say, and this went on through almost on a nonpartisan basis, and I took part in my various jobs. I can remember when I was Secretary of Treasury, of course, when I was Secretary of State, working on these issues. I think it's fair to say that when Ronald Reagan walked off the stage, Cold War was basically over. And you could say that there was constructed in the world an economic and security commons from which everybody benefited. And that was done with great leadership from the United States. It wasn't the United States went and said, do this, do this, do this. Rather, when the United States came with ideas and resources and the problem-solving frame of mind, people responded, interacted, and constructive results emerged. That's how it was done. But there was huge leadership from the U.S. And you had people, unusual people. President Truman deserves a lot of credit. When the idea of the Marshall Plan emerged, lots of presidents would have said, call it the Truman Plan. He didn't. He knew Marshall was very much respected in Europe and, of course, in our Congress. So he said, let's call it the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan, I might say, is kind of a good example of how to go about things. Because we didn't say, okay, the Marshall Plan is we're going to tell you how to do things in Europe. The Marshall Plan said, look, make yourself a plan for what you think it takes to get your economy going, country X. And bring it to us, and we'll talk about it, and agree on something sensible, and if there's some resources needed to help it along, we got it. So people were working on their plan. Psychologically, it makes all the difference in the world. So security and economic commons was built, and everybody benefited. I'm sorry to say that is falling apart, really big time. And we see now a world awash in change, almost everywhere you look. The economies are in terrible shape. And if you want to know what the watchword for the United States is right now, the word is withdraw. We had at Hoover sort of trying to mediate a little bit. We had a group of former Indian and Pakistani former generals and foreign ministers for a couple of days. And the president had just given his West Point speech called for the surge in Afghanistan. And in one of the breaks, I was listening to the two generals, one from Pakistan, one from India. One says, doesn't the president understand the only word anybody heard in that speech was withdraw? You don't tell people what you're not going to do. And they said, withdrawing, that's not the way to win. So here are two particular things that I want to reflect on that are going on. One is Russian actions, and the other is the ISIS development. In a different way, both are trying to destroy the state system. That is the system that says in the world you have sovereign states, and when there are international problems, they interact with each other, and that's the way the world works. Worked pretty well. They're trying to destroy it. Let's take them one at a time. Russia first carved out two new countries in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And now they have gone on into the Ukraine. And I think quite obviously what Russia seeks to do is dominate the states that were in the old Soviet Union and change the system from a state system to a spheres of influence system where they dominate, if that's what they're trying to do. And they're doing a pretty good job of it right now. So let me review basically what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, what our strengths are, and what we should do about it. First of all, one of their strengths is they have shown that they will use force. I remember one day when I was in Marine Corps boot camp. And everybody has boot camp memories, but I remember the sergeant handed me my rifle. He says, take good care of this rifle, this is your best friend. And remember one thing, never point this rifle at anybody unless you're willing to pull the trigger. No empty threats. So when you draw a red line, and the red line is crossed and you don't do anything, nobody pays attention to what you say anymore. You have shown your threats are empty. But in the Russian case, they had shown that they would pull the trigger. They also have immense supplies of oil and gas. And most of the countries that are in the former Soviet space are dependent on them for oil and gas supplies. So that's something. They have demonstrated that they will cut off your glass in the middle of the winter and let you freeze. What to do. So those are strengths. They're also weaknesses. Because their willingness to use force has caused all of those countries around to start looking over at their borders and starting to worry. And they're also saying Russia has demonstrated that it's not a reliable supplier of oil and gas. So maybe we should diversify ourselves. It's also the case that Russia has a demographic catastrophe on its hands. Fertility is very low. The longevity of men in Russia is only about 64. 25% of men in Russia die before they're 55 years old. It's appalling. So they have a demographic, and a lot of the brightest young people are leaving. Silicon Valley's got plenty of them. So demographically, they are in deep trouble. They're also very dependent on the oil and gas sales. Their economy, without those sales, is in really deep trouble. Of course, the drop in prices has hurt their economy badly. But if they lose market share in these countries that they've been supplying, they will get hurt even more. So what should we be doing? I think, first of all, we are stupid in letting our armed forces decline the way we're doing right now. We've got to get back to the Ronald Reagan days and say, okay, what do you need? I remember when I took over as the director of the budget, Mel Laird was Secretary of Defense. I said, Mel, you and I may have a few conversations about one thing or another, but let's remember one thing. He said, what's that? I said, what the commandant wants, the commandant gets. What they need to have the most up-to-date stuff. We need to focus our R&D. We need to train. Any Marine knows, train. That's the way you get somewhere. You talk to this Special Forces guys, the SEALs, they came and talked to us. The training they do is extraordinary, so we've got to invest in that and get their end strength where it should be, and not allow our number of ships to be declining as we're doing. So we're going to build that up, and then we need to say to our NATO partners, come on, let's get with it. And let's put some forces around in the Baltic states. They're very nervous, in the Poles and so on, and show that we have strength and it's there. We also have to say we're willing to pull the trigger. Then we need to have a real energy initiative. And the United States can organize it now with all of the changes that have been made. Is a perfect time for us to organize an energy initiative and do everything we can to see that all of these countries have a multiplicity of supply sources. In Lithuania today, in their bay, they have a LNG receiving ship. They're getting their LNG from Norway. But this notion that the United States is not allowed to export oil and gas, we've got to get away from that and be ready to supply these people and take away some of that market share. Then we need to crank up our Voice of America. Remember Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe. All of the archival material from there has come into the Hoover Institution. So we had a conference a few years ago. And the people who did it are people who looked at that archival material carefully. The people who run the BBC and the Voice of America. And we had some people from behind the Iron Curtain who were officials there, and some who looked at some of their archival material. And we had two questions. One, did anything work? And two, if so, what worked and what did we learn in the process? It turned out that it was unanimous. It really worked. It did a lot. And they did learn, and there's a lot you can learn looking at this material. So I think we should be cranking that up again. And we should be sending factual material into Russia, saying, here's the reality. It's a very uneasy regime. Look at the protest for the murder of this dissident the other day. And when four girls sit around and sing songs that are mocking the regime, and you have to arrest them, you know that you're a little on the tender edge. So we should be saying the truth into Russia in a big way, and rallying people and letting people see there's some leadership here. And we're willing to do things, but we want other people to do things. And we can turn this around. And when we do, of course, we don't want to try to isolate Russia forever. On the contrary, Russia brings a lot to the party. So when the time is right, as we did in the Reagan period, we fought like hell in the Reagan period, but when the time was right, we had an off-ramp, and we got the Cold War coming from that. So we need to take that kind of approach, and I think if we will get ourselves up to speed, we can do it. It'll work. It'll change the world for the better. Then we have this ISIS phenomenon. And there are all kinds of things you can say, who's to blame for this or that. Let's stop worrying about that. What do we do? Well, first of all, let's describe it. It has an Islamic base. Sorry about that, but that's the reality. And there is ways in which the people who are doing this are justifying themselves from the Quran. And most other people will read different things different ways, but nevertheless they have an Islamic base. And they seek to develop a caliphate. And they say, we do not believe in countries. We believe in societies across the world living in a certain way. And that's our belief. And people who don't share that belief are people that we want to kill in the most brutal way possible. So that's who they are. It has a certain resonance, apparently, all over the world. And so they gain adherents. They gain in partly for that. They gain in partly because they have some successes, and they now hold territory and have finances and so on. All of that organizational capability. So what do we do? Well, I think first of all, we challenge them militarily, as we're gradually getting around to doing. But we have to do it in a clear, determined way. We're there to win, and we can win. We will win if we work at it. There's no way to take territory from the air. You can help a lot on the ground, but you can't hold any territory from an airplane. You've got to have people there. And obviously we want most of the people to be from the countries who are there and have the greatest stake. But as in the post-World War II period, the United States has to give a lead. I'm sorry about that, but that's a reality. And we can do that. And I think we also need to crank up our thinking about how to project the facts to the world at large and to the Muslim community at large. You have big Muslim community. Indonesia is basically a Muslim Islamic country. India has huge amounts, Pakistan. So we need to get the message of the realities out and interpretations of the Quran out there and vigorously pursue them. So in a sense we have a war of ideas and we're going to be part of that war. So if we're willing to do things, we'll take people on militarily, but mostly take them on in the world of ideas. And I might say in the world of economics, and we have to persuade a few countries that have thought they're going to bribe their way out of their difficulties by giving finances to these people. And then they'll be let alone to realize in the end, pal, you're not going to be let alone, you're in crosshairs. So stop. I'm not going to name countries, but you all know who they are. And they have to wake up. So if we do these things, we can get the world reconstructed. We can go back to a system of space. And once again, do our best to create, and we probably can't make it as good as it was, but we can make it much better than it is now. A security and economic commons from which everybody can benefit. And when they see those benefits, then they want to keep what they have. There are all sorts of particular things that you could, and questions you want to ask about, for instance, the Israeli-Palestinian thing, I can tell you how to get that problem solved. But anyway, so that's my view, that we have these huge problems, and they're identifiable. If we can be halfway as smart as Admiral Nimitz, and if we can fight back the way he fought back, and if we can be innovative in the way we go about things and determined, and remember what the boot camp wisdom, we don't need to be saying, we don't need to be having threats all over the place. To some extent, I remember Ted Williams, the great slugger for the Boston Red Sox. He wouldn't give a talk, he wouldn't give a press conference. And somebody said, hey Ted, why aren't you talking? He said, I let my back do the talking. So we can say a few things, but mostly we can let people conclude, except we're going to let them know what the realities are in our versions of the Voice of America, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, and take lessons from that. And we'll get a better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. We have some time for a couple of questions. We've got individuals, Marty, Chris, John.
Comments on the Netanyahu speech yesterday?
I watched part of it. I wasn't able to watch it all. But I thought it was an important reminder that we could be heading into a catastrophe if we're not careful. If you apply the Ronald Reagan playbook to the Iran situation, here's what you would do. First of all, be realistic. Let's describe Iran right and remind ourselves, and maybe try to do that. Iran is the leading state sponsor of terrorism and has been from day one of this regime. They've killed people, Americans, directly, and they have lots of proxies that they use. You know who they are. So they're that. They are developing ballistic missiles. Why in the world do they want ballistic missiles? They are developing a nuclear infrastructure that is impressive. There's no way you can conceivably justify that infrastructure on the grounds they need it for running nuclear reactors. So I think reality is Iran is clearly wanting to develop a nuclear weapon capability with a ballistic missile to use it. And they have in no way renounced their terrorism intentions. About 5 times a day they say they want to wipe out Israel. As Bibi said, in America we worry about our security. In Israel they worry about their existence. One nuclear bomb on Tel Aviv would do it. But if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia will get one, believe me. They'll buy one from Pakistan. I mean, I don't say that because I know it, but I assume that would probably happen. And so would other countries in the Middle East get them. And before long, one's going to go up somewhere. Any kind of a nuclear exchange is a global catastrophe because it puts a lot up in the air. We wouldn't be worrying about global warming anymore. We would cool us off, believe me, in a way that you wouldn't want. So I think that the negotiations that are going on, I believe, are not being conducted in a tough way. We've had a policy in our country for a long time that said we're willing to share and see people get the technology to build a nuclear power plant. We draw a very sharp line on enrichment. The deal that was cut by the Bush administration with the UAE, for instance, helps them get the capacity for nuclear power, but has a very sharp line against enrichment. That has been the stance of the UN Security Council resolutions on Iran.